$752 million. That is not a renovation budget. That is the price just to legally walk inside, right next to a packed NFL stadium. An 18-story structure covering nearly 10 acres sits completely abandoned, not collapsed, not destroyed, just economically impossible to justify. This was once called the eighth wonder of the world, a system powerful enough to control weather indoors, a place that redefined how America built sports, entertainment, and cities. And now it has become a billion-dollar question. What happens when something is too important to demolish, but too expensive to save? What happens when the system itself no longer makes financial sense, and no one knows how to fix it? An 18-story building, spread across more than 9.5 acres, sits in the shadow of one of the busiest stadiums in Houston, surrounded by parking lots that fill every game day. Traffic flows, fans arrive, money moves, but right next door, nothing happens. No crowds, no lights, no events, just silence. The structure is fully intact. The steel is strong. The roof still stands. The systems are simply turned off. And yet no one is allowed inside. Not because it failed, but because bringing it back to basic safety standards would cost $752 million before a single upgrade, before a single seat is sold, before a single dollar of revenue returns. This is not a construction failure. This is not poor engineering. This is something deeper. A system that once worked perfectly, now locked in a position where every option is too expensive, too political, or too complex to execute. It cannot generate income. It cannot be easily removed. And it cannot be ignored. This is where infrastructure becomes a financial paradox. And what you are looking at is not just an abandoned building. It is a system that has reached a point where the math no longer works. And once the math breaks, everything else follows. In the 1960s, Houston was exploding with growth. Oil money was flowing. NASA was expanding. Population was rising fast. The city wanted to prove it belonged on the national stage, and it needed something bold, something no other city had. So the idea was simple but radical. If the heat and humidity made outdoor sports unbearable, bring the outdoors inside. Build a stadium that could control its own climate. In 1965, the Astrodome was born, a structure with a 642-foot clear-span roof, no interior columns, 4,596 skylight panels, and an air conditioning system pushing 2 million cubic feet of air every minute. It was not just engineering. It was a statement of power, a system designed to attract people, events, and money. Baseball games, NFL matchups, rodeos, concerts, everything flowed through one building. Every ticket sold, every seat filled, every event booked. It all translated into revenue. The Astrodome was not just a stadium, it was a cash-generating machine at the center of a growing city. And for years it worked exactly as intended. But beneath that success, hidden inside the design itself, a flaw was already forming. Small at first, almost invisible, but powerful enough to eventually break the entire system. At first, the design looked like a strength. A single stadium that could host everything: baseball, football, concerts, massive events, all under one roof. It sounded efficient, flexible, even futuristic. But over time, that flexibility became a problem, because a circular stadium is never perfect for any one sport. For baseball, sightlines were awkward. Many seats faced the wrong angles, making the experience less immersive. For football, the same shape pushed fans farther away from the field, reducing energy, reducing engagement. And when the experience drops, so does the value of every seat at the same time. A new generation of stadiums began to emerge across the country, designed with precision, built specifically for one sport, optimized for visibility, comfort, and most importantly, revenue. These new venues introduced luxury suites, premium club seating, exclusive sections that could generate several times more income per seat. This changed the entire business model of sports infrastructure. Teams were no longer just playing games, they were maximizing revenue per square foot. And the Astrodome, despite its scale and history, had none of these advantages. It could not compete on experience, and it could not compete on pricing. And slowly, almost quietly, the money began to move elsewhere. And once the cash flow starts to leave a system, it rarely comes back. By the 1990s, The numbers made the situation impossible to ignore. Teams were no longer satisfied with packed seats. They wanted higher margins, more premium inventory, more control over revenue streams. They began demanding new stadiums designed for modern economics, not legacy design. They wanted luxury suites, naming rights, sponsorship zones, and high-value experiences that could multiply income without increasing attendance. And when those demands were not met, they made a decision that changed everything. The NFL team left in 1996, the MLB team followed in 2000, and just like that, the Astrodome lost its core tenets. No teams meant no consistent events. No events meant no predictable revenue. And without cash flow, the entire financial model collapsed. But the costs never disappeared. It would take $55 million just to demolish the structure, and $752 million just to bring it up to basic safety standards. Before any modernization, before any redesign, before any revenue could return. At that point, the building stopped behaving like an asset. It became a liability, something that consumes resources without producing value. And this is where the crisis deepens, because once a structure reaches this stage, every option becomes expensive, every delay becomes costly, and every decision becomes political, and what looks like a simple abandoned building is actually a financial problem with no easy exit. And the worst part is, the system is still not at its breaking point. Fun 5. Kwekchiern Hethong. The problem is no longer just financial, it is legal. And once law enters the system, everything slows down. In 2014, the Astrodome was added to the National Register of Historic Places. And in 2017, it was designated a state antiquities landmark, placing it in the same category as some of the most protected historical assets in Texas. That status changes everything, because now the building is no longer just real estate. It is protected heritage, which means demolition is no longer a simple decision. It requires approvals, reviews, and navigating layers of regulation that can take years, sometimes decades. And the result is a system with no clear path forward. You cannot tear it down easily. You cannot upgrade it cheaply. And you cannot generate revenue from it in its current state. This creates a locked asset, a structure that sits in place consuming land, attention, and political capital without producing economic value. And this is where the conflict becomes visible. History demands preservation, economics demands efficiency, and politics sits in the middle trying to satisfy both. But satisfying both often means doing nothing. Proposals come and go, plans get announced and quietly disappear. Funding gaps remain, and each year, the cost only grows higher. What you are seeing is not indecision. It is a system where every option carries a penalty, and choosing any path creates consequences. But the real twist is not the legal gridlock. It is what this situation reveals about how modern infrastructure systems actually fail. This is no longer a story about a stadium, and it is not really about renovation costs. The real issue is something far more dangerous. It is a capital trap, a situation where an asset loses its ability to function economically, but cannot be removed from the system. It generates no revenue. It cannot be easily sold. It cannot be repurposed without massive upfront cost, and yet it continues to consume space, political attention, and financial planning. The Astrodome is just one example, but the pattern is repeating across the United States. Aging bridges that are too critical to shut down, but too expensive to replace. Outdated airports that cannot scale, but cannot be abandoned. Industrial sites that no longer produce, but still occupy valuable land. And in each case, the same dynamic appears. The cost to exit becomes so high that decision-makers delay action, and delay turns into paralysis, and paralysis turns into systemic drag. Because capital that is stuck cannot be redeployed. Land that is locked cannot be optimized. And systems that cannot evolve begin to slow everything around them. This is how infrastructure fails in the modern era. Not through collapse, but through stagnation. Not through visible disaster, but through invisible inefficiency. And once enough of these traps accumulate, the entire economic system starts to lose flexibility. And when flexibility disappears, growth becomes harder to sustain. Right now, there is a new proposal on the table, a redevelopment plan priced at around $840 million, combining a hotel, office space, retail, and entertainment. On paper, it makes sense. It brings life back. It creates new revenue streams. It reconnects the site to the surrounding economy. But the core problem has not changed. Before any of that vision can begin, someone has to spend $752 million just to make the building usable, just to meet basic safety standards. And no private investor wants to absorb that kind of upfront cost without guaranteed returns. This is where the real lesson emerges. The cities that win in the future will not be the ones that build the fastest. They will be the ones that manage transitions the smartest, the ones that know when to preserve, when to replace, and when to let go. Because when capital gets trapped, growth slows down. And when a system cannot release its own past, it quietly becomes the biggest barrier to its own future. Because in the end, the ability to exit may matter more than the ability to build.